All right, let's dive into the story of a true revolutionary. A woman who looked at this 5-ton monster of metal and gears and somehow saw the future. We're going to talk about Admiral Grace Hopper and the incredible, repeatable system she built, not just for coding, but for achieving radical clarity in pretty much any field. So how did she do it? Well, it all kicked off with one single powerful realization.
This one sentence, this is the key to her entire legacy. So picture this, it's 1944, the world's at war. And over at Harvard, a team is wrestling with the Mark I computer, a 50-foot beast of clicking relays that fills up an entire room. But while everyone else saw a really complicated calculator, Grace Hopper saw a communication barrier. She knew the real challenge wasn't just making the machine work, it was making it understandable. This wasn't a math problem, it was a translation problem. And that single realization, well, it was about to change the world forever.
So here's how we're going to break down her genius today. We'll start with that defining aha moment, the translator's revelation. Then we'll see how her incredible resilience was forged in rejection. After that, we'll get into her core philosophy, the clarity mindset, and then get hands-on with her deconstruction system. And finally, we'll look at the legacy of how she coded a new world. And, this is the most important part, how you can find your own code for greatness in everything she did.
Okay, so let's go right back to that first big revelation. Imagine walking into a basement at Harvard and coming face to face with this 55-foot beast of clicking relays and spinning shafts. It's loud, it's intimidating, and it speaks this bizarre language of holes punched in paper tape. Now the experts, they think their job is just to feed the beast, but Grace Hopper, she saw a totally different mission. And this right here, this is that massive shift in her thinking. See, most people just saw their job as following the machine's rigid rules. They just accepted that it was complicated, and that was that. Hopper's revelation was to completely flip that script. Her job wasn't to follow rules. It was to build a bridge between what a person wanted and what the machine could do. She decided to stop accepting complexity and start weaponizing clarity. I love that phrase. Using simplicity like a sharp tool to cut through all the confusion and empower everybody, not just the experts. And this insight, this is really the birth of what we can call the Hopper rule. She figured out something absolutely crucial. Real authority doesn't come from your job title. It comes from being the person who can make complicated things understandable. Her insatiable curiosity wasn't just some cute personality trait. It became her most effective, most lethal professional weapon. The person who simplifies, who translates, who clarifies, that's the person who really holds the power.
But, an idea this revolutionary doesn't just pop into someone's head out of nowhere. To really get it, you've got to look at how her strength was forged in rejection. Her entire professional philosophy was built on this personal fortress of logic that she was basically forced to build early in her life.
Yeah, this timeline, it says so much. Come on, at 7 years old, she wasn't just playing around. She systematically took apart every single alarm clock in her house, just to figure out how they worked. She needed to see the truth in the gears. This analytical hunger drove her all the way through Vassar and a PhD from Yale. But when she tried to serve her country in 1941, the system just shut her down. At 34, they told her she was too old. They told her she was too small. But here's the thing about Grace Hopper. She just did not take no for an answer. She fought for a waiver, and she got one.
And this created the central conflict of her whole life. With her brain, she was an absolute insider, a brilliant professor with a mind that her father encouraged her to use without any limits. But because she was a woman, she was always the outsider. In a world that was constantly pushing tradition, she saw the so-called safety of the classroom as a prison for her potential. And as the only woman on the Mark I team, that isolation forced her to become completely self-reliant. And, this is key, it forced her to unlearn the habit of asking for permission.
So, out of all that friction, that constant need to prove herself on her own terms, this incredibly powerful philosophy was born. And this wasn't just about writing code, it was a whole mindset. A mindset that was all about the human being at the other end of the machine. This famous quote pretty much became her operating principle. It was a direct rejection of just sitting on the sidelines. She knew that if you wait for someone to give you permission to innovate, you're going to be waiting forever. If she had waited, she never would have left that Vassar classroom. This was basically her declaration of independence from a system that was way too slow and rigid to see the future she was building.
The best way to describe her whole approach is radical clarity. And the key word here is strategy. For her, simplicity wasn't just, a preference. It was a deliberate, strategic choice. She understood that if you could break down a complex idea into its simplest, most logical pieces, its power becomes undeniable.
You can argue with complexity all day long, but you can't argue with simplicity that works.
And all of this was built on a bedrock she called foundational logic. It's this disciplined belief that the ultimate measure of your work isn't how clever or complex it is, but how accessible it is. The only thing that truly matters is the clarity it gives to the person using it. She treated the computer not as some sacred temple for complex math, but as a laboratory for communication.
Okay, so having a great philosophy is one thing, but how do you actually put it into practice, right? How do you make it real? Well, that's where her deconstruction system comes in. She was a genius at turning these big ideas into tangible, repeatable, daily habits.
Her number one tool was systematic deconstruction. She just flat out refused to accept any problem as one single monolithic challenge. Instead, she would break it down and then break it down again until all she had was a series of simple, understandable steps that anyone could grasp. She knew that if you could make sure every tiny little piece worked perfectly, the whole thing would be unbreakable.
And this process evolved into our famous Debugging Protocol, which is a system anyone can use for any problem. First, isolate the true source of the issue. Find the one thing that's actually wrong. Famously, this led her team to find the first actual bug, a literal moth trapped in a relay. Second, break the problem into its smallest logical steps. Third, make sure each tiny step works perfectly by itself. And fourth, use visual aids to track your logic. You see, this wasn't just about fixing code. It was about achieving total sovereignty over her work. That means having complete understanding and absolute control. It's knowing your work so intimately that no problem can ever truly defeat you. A perfect example of making the abstract real was her famous nanosecond demonstration. To explain why processing speed mattered, she didn't just throw a bunch of big numbers around. She would hand out pieces of wire, each one exactly 11.8 inches long, and she'd say, "This is a nanosecond. This is how far light travels in 1/1000th of a second." Just like that, she made a wildly complex idea tangible, physical, and unforgettable. That was her obsession with clarity in action.
So what happens when a mindset like this is applied relentlessly for decades? The result wasn't just better code. She was able to code an entirely new world. Her legacy is one of radical, world-changing simplification. And the ultimate expression of this whole philosophy was COBOL. It was a programming language that translated all that arcane machine code into plain English commands. I mean, just think about that impact. This single invention democratized software, taking it from a few PhDs in a lab and putting it into the hands of businesses everywhere. It totally destroyed the myth that computing was some dark art only for geniuses. It elevated the programmer from just a technician into an architect of systems. And above all, COBOL proved that a simple English word, applied with relentless logic, could be infinitely more powerful than a million vacuum tubes. And this is where Grace Hopper's story really becomes our story. Her journey is so much more than history. It's a practical guide for anyone in any field who's ever felt totally overwhelmed by complexity.
So I want you to ask yourself this question, and be honest. Look at your work, your projects, your goals. Where have you been overcomplicating things? Maybe it's to seem busy or to feel important. Where is that jargon just a shield you're hiding behind? Where are you using complexity just to avoid the really hard work of making something simple, clear, and truly useful?
So here's the challenge for you this week. I want you to find your nanosecond. Find that one meeting that could have been an email. Find that one jargon-filled report that could be a single, clear paragraph. Find that one task you've been putting off because it feels too big, and just break it down into its smallest, most obvious first step. The invitation here is to commit so deeply to the simple that you finally find the build. Stop planning in the abstract and start building from a place of radical clarity. Because in the end, that's the ultimate lesson from Grace Hopper's life. When you raise your level of clarity, you stop being a victim of the machine, whatever that machine is in your life, and you become the master of the language. So just remember this: complexity is a lie, and your simplification is the code for your greatness.